The hammer swung, not against hot iron, but against the gut of a man named Slade. Caleb hadn't meant to hit him that hard. The man just wouldn't listen. "Lay off, Mrs. Hatcher," he'd said. Clear as day. Slade crumpled, clutching his middle, spitting curses and coal dust. The other two, wiry men named Finch and Dobie, went for their irons. Caleb didn't wait. He'd seen this play out too many times in the territories. He knew the look in their eyes. Greed, plain and simple. He moved like a man half his age, a blur of leather and sweat. Finch got off a shot that whizzed past Caleb's ear, kicking up dust near the anvil. Caleb ducked low, using the blacksmith's forge as cover. Dobie, slower on the draw, found himself staring down the barrel of Caleb's own revolver, a worn Colt Peacemaker he'd carried since his days chasing shadows in the war. "Drop it." Caleb's voice was low, gravelly. It wasn't a request. Dobie hesitated, his eyes darting between Caleb's hardened face and the unconscious Slade. He swallowed hard and let the gun clatter to the hard-packed earth. Finch, seeing his advantage gone, cursed and did the same. Mrs. Hatcher watched from the doorway of her meager homestead shack, her face etched with worry and weariness. 3 small children, tow-headed and thin, clung to her skirts, their eyes wide with fear. The drought had been hard on everyone, but it had hit her hardest. Her husband, Thomas, had been a good man, but luck hadn't been on his side. Now, these vultures were circling, trying to pick clean what little he'd left behind. Caleb holstered his revolver, the metallic click echoing in the still desert air. He hadn't planned on getting involved. He just wanted to shoe a horse, maybe grab a bite at the diner. But something about the way Slade had been talking to Mrs. Hatcher, the way he'd been looking at her land, it had rubbed him raw. It reminded him of things he'd rather forget. He picked up Dobie's gun, examined it briefly, then tossed it into the water trough. Finch's followed. "Get off her land," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "And don't come back." Slade, groaning, struggled to his feet. He glared at Caleb, his eyes full of venom. "This ain't over, old man. You ain't seen the last of us." Caleb just stared back, his face an unreadable mask. He'd heard that threat before. He'd lived it. Slade, Finch, and Dobie mounted their horses and rode off in a cloud of dust, leaving Mrs. Hatcher and her children standing alone in the face of the setting sun. Caleb watched them go, a knot of unease tightening in his gut. He knew they'd be back. They always came back. He just hoped he'd be ready when they did. He glanced at the widow, her face still pale. There was a storm coming, and not just in the Cowboy. Days bled into weeks under the relentless sun. Caleb returned to the forge, the clang of hammer on steel a familiar rhythm against the backdrop of his unease. He knew Slade wouldn't let it go. Men like that didn't. But he tried to put it out of his mind, focusing on the work, the sweat stinging his eyes, the smell of burning coal filling his lungs. Then came the auction. Dust devils danced down Main Street, swirling around the legs of townsfolk, gathered outside the weathered clapboard building that served as the town hall. A traveling salesman was leaving town, auctioning off his failed business. Caleb hadn't intended to go, but the heat in the forge had become unbearable. He needed air, a distraction. The auctioneer, a portly man with a booming voice and a wet-stained collar, rattled through a feast of mundane items, dented pots, chipped china, a moth-eaten rug. Caleb leaned against a post, watching, his eyes scanning the crowd. He spotted Mrs. Hatcher in the back, her face pale, her children clinging to her. She looked smaller than he remembered, swallowed by the vastiness of the land, the weight of her circumstance. He wondered if Slade and his cronies were lurking somewhere nearby. Then the auctioneer announced the last item. "And now, folks, we have lot number 12. The old Bartlett place, 40 acres, more or less. Been abandoned for, well, let's just say a good long while. Needs some work. but the land's still good. Who'll give me $1? A few hesitant hands went up. The Bartlett place, Caleb knew the name. It was out past the creek, a patch of land known for its stubborn soil and bad luck. Whispers of tragedy clung to it, like morning mist. The price climbed slowly, haltingly. 50 cents. 75. $1. Caleb watched the bidding, a strange feeling stirring within him. He didn't need land. He had the forge. But something about the neglected farm, the way it had been cast aside, resonated with him. Maybe it was the same feeling he had when he looked at Mrs. Hatcher and her kids. Something lost, something broken. $1.25, an auctioneer called. The crowd was thinning, their interest waning. Caleb surprised himself. He raised his hand. $2. A ripple of silence spread through the crowd. Heads turned. Snickers erupted. $2 for the Bartlett place? It was practically giving it away. $2, the auctioneer exclaimed, his eyes widening. Do I hear $2.50? Anyone? No one spoke. The only sound was the buzzing of flies and the distant creak of a windmill. The auctioneer looked at Caleb, a mixture of confusion and amusement on his face. Going once, going twice, sold, to the gentleman in the back for $2. Caleb lowered his hand, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and unease. He'd bought a farm. He, a blacksmith, who knew more about shaping iron than planting seeds. What had he done? He ignored the veiled warnings and sighed long glances as he paid the auctioneer, the $2 silver feeling heavy in his palm. He knew the rumors about the Bartlett place. He'd heard the stories of misfortune and despair, but he didn't care. He had a feeling, a pull, that he couldn't explain. As he walked away from the auction, he noticed a figure standing in the shadows across the street, watching him. It was a woman, her face hidden beneath the wide brim of a straw hat. She didn't move, didn't speak. She just watched. Caleb felt a prickle of unease. He couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just stepped into something much bigger than himself. Something that had been waiting for him all along. He had $2 and a dream, maybe. Or maybe just $2 and a whole lot of trouble. Caleb didn't go straight to the Bartlett place. He walked back to his forge, the dust sticking to the sweat on his brow. He needed a plan, or at least the semblance of one. He couldn't just show up, $2 in his pocket, and expect the land to magically bloom. He had tools to gather, supplies to buy, and a whole lot of questions to answer, starting with why he'd even bid on the damn place in the first place. He worked late into the night, the rhythmic clang of the hammer a soothing balm against the gnawing unease. He shaped horseshoes, mended wagon wheels, and sharpened plow blades, his mind sighing, trying to make sense of the impulse that had seized him at the auction. He told himself it was the land, the challenge of coaxing life back from the neglected soil. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. It was the look in Mrs. Hatcher's eyes, the vulnerability of her children, the echo of his own past. He was drawn to broken things, always had been. The next morning, he hitched his old mule, Bess, to a rickety wagon and loaded it with tools, a bedroll, and a sack of dried beans and salt pork. He swung by the general store and bought a shovel, a pickaxe, and a bag of seed, mostly corn and beans, hardy crops that could withstand the harsh climate. He also picked up a small worn book on farming, its pages yellowed and brittle. He wasn't a farmer, but he figured he could learn. The Bartlett place was further out than he remembered, a good 2-hour ride from town. The road grew rougher, the landscape more desolate. The wind howled through the canyons, carrying whispers of dust and forgotten dreams. As he crested a small rise, he saw it, the Bartlett place. It was worse than he imagined. The house, what was left of it, stood like a skeletal hand against the vast sky, its windows empty sockets staring out at the world. The roof had collapsed in place, the walls were cracked and weathered, and the porch sagged precariously. The fields were overgrown with weeds and thistles, the soil dry and cracked. It looked like the land itself was mourning. Caleb pulled the wagon to a stop, his heart sinking. What had he gotten himself into? He climbed down from the wagon, Bess shifting nervously behind him. He walked towards the house, the silhouettes broken only by the creak of the wind and the mournful cry of a hawk circling overhead. As he got closer, he noticed something glinting in the sun near the front door. He bent down and picked it up. It was a small tarnished silver locket, its clasp broken. He opened it. Inside were two tiny photographs, a man and a woman. Their faces faded but still recognizable. They looked happy, hopeful. He tucked the locket into his pocket, a sense of melancholy washing over him. He felt like he was trespassing on someone else's grief. He spent the rest of the day clearing brush and trying to make the house habitable. He patched the roof with scraps of wood, swept out the dust and debris, and cleared a small space to lay his bedroll. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the land, he built a small fire and cooked a meager meal of beans and bacon. As he sat by the fire eating his supper, he heard a sound, a faint rustling in the bushes nearby. He tensed, his hand instinctively reaching for the revolver he had placed beside him. "Hello?" he called out, his voice low. Silence. He waited, his senses on high alert. Then he heard it again, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. Mary. The name hung in the air, carried on the wind. Mary. He remembered the rumors he'd heard in town, whispers of the Bartlett family, of a fever that had swept through the house, claiming the lives of the parents and one of the children. There was only one survivor, a young girl named Mary, who had disappeared shortly after the tragedy. Some said she'd run away, driven mad by grief. Others said she'd been taken by Indians. Still others whispered that she died on the land, her spirit forever bound to the Bartlett place. Caleb felt a chill run down his spine. He didn't believe in ghosts, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that he wasn't alone on the Bartlett place. He looked out at the darkness, his eyes straining to see through the shadows. He was sure of one thing. The Bartlett place held secrets, secrets that were buried deep within the soil and within the heart of the girl who may still be there. The next morning, Caleb set about exploring the rest of the property. The fields were his priority, but something drew him to the old barn, a hulking structure of weathered wood and rusted tin that stood a short distance from the house. It leaned precariously to one side, its doors hanging open like a broken jaw. He figured it would be a good place to store his tools and maybe shelter Bess from the elements if he could manage to shore it up. He approached cautiously, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. Sunlight streamed through the gaps in the walls, illuminating swirling dust motes. The barn was filled with the remnants of a forgotten life, rusted farm equipment, broken tools, and piles of decaying hay. He could hear the skittering of mice and the cooing of pigeons in the rafters. As he ventured deeper into the barn, he noticed something odd. A pile of hay in the corner seemed to be moving. He stopped, his hand instinctively reaching for the handle of his shovel. He held his breath and listened. There it was again, a soft rustling sound, like something shifting beneath the hay. He crept closer, his heart pounding in his chest. He reached out and pulled back a layer of hay, revealing a pair of eyes, wide green eyes, filled with a mixture of fear and defiance. Caleb froze. He stared at the eyes, and the eyes stared back at him. He slowly pulled back more of the hay, revealing a face, a young face, smudged with dirt and grime. It was a girl, no older than 15, her hair a tangled mess of brown and blonde. She was dressed in rags, her clothes torn and filthy. She looked like a wild animal, cornered and ready to fight. He recognized those eyes. He'd seen them before. In the shadows of the night, whispering the name Mary. He lowered his shovel, his voice soft. "Hello," he said, his voice gentle. "I'm not going to hurt you." The girl didn't respond. She just stared at him, her eyes darting back and forth, as if searching for an escape. He could see the fear in her eyes, the desperation. He knew that look. He'd worn it himself, a long time ago. He slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of bread he'd saved from his breakfast. He held it out to her, his hand steady. "Here," he said, "I brought you something to eat." The girl hesitated, her eyes fixed on the bread. She looked like she hadn't eaten in days. He could almost feel her hunger, a gnawing emptiness that mirrored his own. He gently tossed the bread towards her. It landed a few feet away. She didn't move. She just watched him, her eyes wary. He took a step back, giving her space. "I'm just here to fix up the place," he said. "I bought it at auction. I don't want to cause you any trouble." He waited, his heart aching for this wild child, this lost soul who had so somehow survived into this desolate place. He knew that she was Mary, the daughter of the Bartlett family, the girl who had vanished after the tragedy. He didn't know how she'd survived, or what she'd been through, but he knew that she was vulnerable, broken just like the land itself. And just like the land, she needed someone to care for her, to nurture her, to give her a chance to heal. Slowly, cautiously, the girl reached out and snatched the bread. She devoured it in a few bites, her eyes never leaving his. He could see a flicker of something in her eyes, a glimmer of trust, or maybe just a desperate hunger. He knew that this was just the beginning. He had a long way to go to earn her trust, to help her heal. But he was willing to try. He had $2 and a broken farm, and now, a wild child. He had a feeling that the Bartlett place and Mary had a way of healing him too. Days turned into a rhythm of toil and quiet observation. Caleb started with the well, choked with debris and neglect. He spent hours hauling buckets of muck, his back aching, the sun beating down on his neck. He knew water was life. Without it, nothing would grow, and neither would Mary. She watched him, always from a distance, sometimes from the shadow of the barn, other times from the edge of the overgrown fields. He'd catch glimpses of her, a flash of ragged clothing, a glint of sunlight on her wild hair. He never pushed, never called out to her. He just kept working, letting his actions speak for him. Once the well was cleared, he turned his attention to the fields. The soil was hard, cracked, and riddled with weeds. He hitched Bess to an old plow he had found in the barn and began to break the ground, the mule straining against the weight, the plow biting into the earth. It was back-breaking work, but with each furrow he carved, he felt a sense of purpose, a sense of reclaiming something lost. He planted the corn and beans he'd bought at the general store, scattering the seeds with his calloused hands. He knew it was a gamble. The drought could return. The crops could fail. But he had to try. He had to show Mary that something could still grow here, that life could still bloom on the Bartlett place. One afternoon, as he was mending a section of the barn roof, he noticed Mary was closer than usual. She was standing just inside the barn door, her eyes fixed on him. He climbed down from the ladder, careful not to startle her. "Need something?" he asked, his voice soft. She didn't answer. She just pointed to a rusty old axe that was leaning against the wall. He understood. She wanted to help. He picked up the axe and handed it to her, showing her how to hold it, how to swing it. She watched him intently, her eyes focused, her movements hesitant at first, then gradually, more confident. He showed her how to chop firewood, how to clear brush, how to build a small fire. They worked side by side, in silence. He didn't try to talk to her, didn't try to pry into her past. He just let her stay, letting her learn, letting her find her own way. He saw a spark of life in her eyes, a flicker of hope. The shared labor, the simple act of working together, was forging an unspoken bond between them. One evening, as they sat by the fire, eating a simple meal of beans and bacon, Mary did something he hadn't expected. She reached out and touched his hand, her fingers brushing against his calloused skin. It was a fleeting touch, but it was enough. He looked at her, and he saw a glimmer of trust in her eyes. He knew that the healing process would be long and difficult. He knew that Mary carried deep scars, wounds that would take time to heal. But he was patient. He was willing to wait. He had tamed wild horses, wrestled stubborn iron, and coaxed life from barren land. He knew how to be patient. He also knew that taming the land and taming a heart were not so different after all. Both required patience, perseverance, and a willingness to see the beauty that lay hidden beneath the surface. And he was starting to see that beauty in Mary, a fragile, resilient beauty that was slowly beginning to bloom. The land and Mary were starting to heal, and in their healing, so was he. The Bartlett place, once a symbol of tragedy and despair, was slowly becoming a place of hope, a place of new beginnings. The fragile peace they'd cultivated was shattered with the dust cloud on the horizon. Caleb saw it first, a brown smudge against the azure sky, growing larger, faster. He knew trouble rode on beneath those winds. He glanced at Mary, who had been helping him repair the fence line. She'd seen it too. Her eyes, once so haunted, now held a flicker of apprehension. The riders were 3 strong, mounted on powerful quarter horses, their faces grim. The lead rider, a man built like a bull with a thick gray mustache and eyes that could drill through stone, reined in his horse a few yards from Caleb. Dust swirled around them, coating everything in a fine grit. "You Bartlett," the man barked, his voice a gravelly rasp. Caleb straightened, his hand instinctively drifting towards the revolver at his hip. "Name's Caleb. I own this place." The man snorted, a sound like a bull pawing the ground. "Owned? Past tense. I'm Jedediah Thorne, and this here's my land." He flourished a piece of paper, yellowed and creased, like it had been pulled from a forgotten strongbow. "Got the deed right here to prove it. Bartlett owed me a considerable sum. Defaulted. Now this land is mine." Caleb studied Thorne, his gaze uneaffering. He didn't believe a word of it. He'd seen enough crooked deals and land grabs to recognize one when it stared him in the face. But he also knew that Thorne held all the cars, money, a whore, and the backing of men who wouldn't hesitate to use violence. "Bartlett's dead," Caleb said, his voice low and steady. "His debts died with him." Thorne's eyes narrowed. "That ain't how it works out here. Debt's a hungry dog. It gnaws on everything, and I intend to collect." He gestured towards the dilapidated house, the struggling crops, Mary standing frozen near the fence. "You got till sundown to clear out. Leave everything. Consider it partial payment." Caleb's jaw tightened. It wasn't about the land anymore. It was about Mary. He wouldn't let Thorne take her home, her sanctuary, the fragile hope they had both nurtured. He wouldn't let her be driven back into the shadows. "I ain't going nowhere," Caleb said, his voice hard. "This is my land now. I bought it fair and square." Thorne chuckled, a cold, humorless sound. "Fair and square. You and I both know how these things work, Blacksmith. You're a fool to stand in my way." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "I wouldn't want to see anything, or anyone, get hurt." He glanced at Mary, his eyes lingering on her with a predatory gaze. Caleb's blood ran cold. He stepped forward, placing himself between Thorne and Mary. "You lay a hand on her, and you'll regret the day you were born." Thorne laughed again, a booming, arrogant sound. "You gonna stop me, Blacksmith?" With what? Those calloused hands. You think you can stand against me and my men? Caleb didn't answer. He just stared at Thorne, his eyes burning with a quiet intensity. He knew he was outgunned, outmanned, outmatched. But he also knew that he had something Thorne didn't, a reason to fight. He looked back at Mary, and she stared back at him. He would not let Thorne win. The sun beat down on them, the silence thick with tension. The wind whispered through the canyons, carrying the scent of dust and impending violence. The showdown had come. The claim, the land, and the girl hung in the balance, the scale poised on a knife's edge. Caleb had a choice to make, and that choice would change them all. The air crackled with unspoken threats. Thorne's two men shifted in their saddles, their hands hovering near their guns. Caleb knew a fight here now would be a slaughter. He needed time, a chance to think. "Sundown, you said?" Caleb asked, his voice deceptively calm. Thorne smirked. "That's right. Enjoy your last few hours on my property." He spat on the ground, then wheeled his horse around. "Let's ride, boys." The riders thundered away, leaving Caleb and Mary in a cloud of dust. He watched them disappear over the ridge, his mind racing. He glanced at Mary, her face pale. He knew she understood the gravity of the situation. He walked over to the house, his steps heavy. He needed to see that deed, to understand what he was up against. He found it tucked away in a drawer, the yellowed paper brittle with age. He unfolded it carefully, his eyes scanning the legal jargon. He knew enough about land deeds to understand the basics, but something felt off. He read it again, slower this time, paying attention to every word, every phrase. And then he saw it. A small, almost illegible clause tucked away at the bottom of the document, written in a cramped, spidery hand. He squinted, trying to decipher the faded ink. Furthermore, the transfer of ownership is contingent upon the acceptance of responsibility for the care and well-being of Mary Bartlett, daughter of the deceased. Failure to comply with this stipulation renders the agreement null and void. Caleb stared at the clause, his heart sinking. He read it again, just to be sure. There it was, plain as day. He hadn't just bought a farm. He'd unwittingly bought a responsibility for Mary. He sank into a chair, the deed falling from his hands. He'd come here seeking solitude, a place to escape his past, to rebuild his life. He hadn't been looking for a daughter. He hadn't been looking for any kind of attachment. He just wanted to be left alone. Now, he was bound to this girl, legally and perhaps morally. He looked out the window at Mary, who was still standing by the fence, watching him. He saw the vulnerability in her eyes, the quiet desperation. He knew that Thorne would have no qualms about using her as leverage, about making her life a living hell. He wrestled with his conscience. He could leave. He could pack his meager belongings and ride away, leaving Mary to face Thorne alone. The law was the law, but he could argue he hadn't known about the clause, that he'd been tricked. He could disappear into the vastness of the West, start over somewhere else. But he couldn't. He couldn't abandon her. He'd seen too much suffering in his life, too much injustice. He couldn't stand by and watch Thorne steal her home, her future. He couldn't turn his back on a girl who had already lost so much. He picked up the deed again, his gaze hardening. He might not have wanted this responsibility, but he had it now. And he wasn't going to run away from it. He was going to fight for Mary, for her home, for her future. He didn't know how he was going to do it, but he would find a way. He always did. The sun was slowly inching its way towards the horizon. He had a few hours to figure out how to outsmart Jedediah Thorne and his men. And those hours were ticking away. Caleb found Mary at the well, drawing water. The sun cast long shadows, painting the dry landscape in hues of orange and purple. He approached slowly, the deed clutched in his hand. "Mary," he began, his voice soft, careful. "We need to talk." She looked up, her eyes wary. She knew something was wrong. He could see the question in her gaze, the fear that he was about to abandon her. He held out the deed. This changes things." She took the paper, her fingers trembling. She didn't understand the words, but she recognized the document. It was the key to her home, her life. Caleb pointed to the clause, running his finger along the faded ink. "It says here that whoever owns this land is responsible for your care. That if they don't take care of you, the deal is off." Her eyes widened. She understood now. Thorne wanted the land, but he didn't want her. She was just a burden, a complication. "Thorne will be back at sundown," Caleb continued. "He wants this place. He doesn't care about you." He paused, searching for the right words. This was the hardest thing he'd ever had to do. I can't promise you a life of ease, Mary. This farm is hard work. There will be droughts and storms and times when we barely have enough to eat. But I will protect you. I will keep you safe." He took a deep breath. "But I also understand if you want to go with Thorne. He can offer you a comfortable life, a secure future. You wouldn't have to worry about working in the fields, about going hungry. It's your choice, Mary. And I'll respect whatever you decide." He watched her, his heart aching. He knew he was asking her to make an impossible decision. Comfort or freedom. Security or uncertainty. A life of ease with a man she feared, or a life of hardship with a man she barely knew. She looked at the deed, then at Caleb, then back at the deed. Her face was a mask of confusion and fear. He could see the internal struggle raging within her. Finally she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. He hurt me." Caleb's jaw tightened. He had suspected as much. But hearing her say it out loud was like a punch to the gut. He wanted to kill Thorne, to tear him apart with his bare hands. "I know," he said, his voice low and filled with suppressed rage. "He won't hurt you again. I promise you that." She looked at him, her eyes searching his. She was trying to gauge his sincerity, to see if she could trust him. He met her gaze, his eyes unwavering. He knew he couldn't erase her past, couldn't take away the pain. But he could offer her a future, a chance to heal, a place where she could feel safe. She reached out and touched his hand, her fingers brushing against his. It was the same fleeting touch as before, but this time it felt different. It felt like a promise, a commitment. She shook her head, her eyes filled with determination. "I stay," she said, her voice stronger now. "I stay with you." A wave of relief washed over Caleb. He hadn't realized how much he wanted her to stay. He knew he had made the right decision, not just for her, but for himself as well. He took her hand in his grip firm but gentle. "Then we'll face them together," he said. "We'll face whatever comes." He looked at the setting sun, a fiery orb sinking below the horizon. "We have work to do." The decision had been made. Now they had a fight ahead of them. Mary's decision hung in the air, a fragile seed planted in the parched earth of their lives. Caleb felt the weight of it, the responsibility pressing down on him. He wouldn't fail her. They worked in silence, side by side, preparing the ground for the next planting. The sun beat down relentlessly, but neither of them complained. Caleb showed her how to properly space the seeds, how to water them without drowning them. She watched him intently, her movements mirroring his, her small hands calloused but determined. As they worked, a fragile sense of normalcy began to bloom. The rhythmic clang of the hoe, the whisper of the wind through the tall grass, the shared sweat and toil. It all created a keep-beat, unspoken bond between them. They were building something together. Not just a farm, but a life. Mary surprised him with her resilience. She was quiet, reserved, but she possessed a strength that belied her delicate frame. She learned quickly, her hands becoming more confident with each passing day. She even started to hum softly as she worked, a simple, wordless tune that filled the air with a hint of hope. Caleb found himself watching her, studying her movements, her expressions. He saw the pain in her eyes, the lingering scars of her past. But he also saw the spark of life returning, the flicker of a smile that reached her eyes. He realized that he wasn't just protecting her, he was helping her heal. And in doing so, he was healing himself. They ate their simple meals together in the evenings, sitting on the porch as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. They didn't talk much, but their silence was comfortable, filled with a shared understanding. Sometimes Mary would ask him questions about his past, about his life before he came to the farm. He answered her honestly but sparingly, revealing only what he felt she needed to know. He didn't want to burden her with his own pain, his own regrets. One evening, as they were finishing their meal, Mary looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Caleb," she said softly, for everything." He shrugged, uncomfortable with her praise. "It's nothing, Mary. You would have done the same for me, sis." She shook her head to see. "No," she said, "not everyone would have. Some would have left me like he did." Caleb's jaw tightened. He knew she was talking about her father, about the debt that had led to all of this. "Well, I'm not everyone, Mary," he said, "and I'm not going anywhere." She smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile that lit up her face. "I know," she said. "I know you're not." As the days passed, the seeds they had planted began to sprout, tiny green shoots pushing their way through the soil. It was a sign of hope, a promise of a future. But Caleb knew that their troubles were far from over. Jedediah Thorne would be back. And when he did, Caleb would be ready. He would defend Mary and her home with everything he had. He owed her that much. More than that, he wanted to. He found to his surprise that he wanted to. The first sign came with the livestock. Hens lay stiff in the dust, their beaks agape. The goat, usually a picture of stubborn vitality, was bloated and trembling. Caleb examined the well first, his gut twisting. The metallic tang of something unnatural hit him before he even lowered the bucket. He didn't need to taste it. Thorn. The man was a viper, striking from the shadows. He spat on the parched earth, a sealant curse escaping his lips. He found Mary tending to the dying chickens, her face etched with worry. "Don't drink the water," he told her, his voice tight. "It's been poisoned." Her eyes widened, fear flickering within them. "What will we do?" "We'll manage." Caleb's tone was clipped, reassuring, but he felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. Water was life in this land. Without it, they were finished. That night, under a sliver of moon, the second blow fell. A crackling roar ripped through the stillness. Caleb bolted from the house, Mary stumbling behind him. The barn was engulfed in flames, the dry timbers feeding the inferno with terrifying speed. He tried to get closer, to salvage what he could, but the heat was a physical barrier, pushing him back. The animals inside screamed, a chorus of terror that tore at his soul. He could do nothing but watch as their livelihood, their shelter, turned to ash. Mary stood beside him, her face illuminated by the flickering flames. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but she made no sound. The barn was more than just wood and hay. It was a symbol of their hope, of their future. And now it was gone. "Thorne," she whispered, her voice filled with grief and rage. Caleb nodded, his jaw clenched. He knew it was Thorne. This was his way of breaking them, of driving them off the land. He wanted them to suffer, to lose everything. He pulled Mary close, shielding her from the heat. "We're not beaten yet," he said, his voice low and determined. "He wants us to run. We won't give him the satisfaction. The barn burned until dawn, leaving behind a smoldering skeleton against the pale sky. The air was thick with the stench of smoke and death, a grim reminder of their vulnerability. The poisoned well, the burned barn. Thorne had declared war. Caleb surveyed the devastation, his mind racing. They were isolated, vulnerable, but they weren't defenseless. He had faced worse odds before, and he had survived. He would protect Mary, even if it meant sacrificing everything. He looked at her, her face smudged with soot, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and defiance. He saw the same resilience in her that he saw in himself. They were both survivors. He took her hand, his grip firm. He said, his voice resolute. We start again. We show him that he can't break us. The smoky sky was a grim canvas, painting a picture of hardship and loss. But beneath the smoke, beneath the ashes, a spark of hope remained. They would fight for their land, for their future, for each other. The battle had just begun. The barn groaned, a tortured beast succumbing to the flames. A section of the roof buckled, then crashed inward, sending a shower of sparks skyward. Caleb, driven by a desperate need to save what livestock remained, lunged towards the burning structure, ignoring Mary's frantic cries. He managed to pry open the weakened door of a small stall, releasing a terrified calf that bolted into the darkness. But as he turned to retreat, a support beam, weakened by the intense heat, gave way. The world tilted, and Caleb felt a searing pain as the beam slammed into his shoulder, pinning him against the stall. He cried out, a muffled sound lost in the roar of the fire. He struggled against the weight, but the beam was too heavy, his shoulder throbbing with agonizing pain. He was trapeze. Panic clawed at his throat. He saw the flames licking at the stall, edging closer. He closed his eyes, accepting his fate. He had faced death before, but not like this, not trapped and helpless. Then a surge of adrenaline coursed through him. He couldn't give up. He had promised to protect Mary. He couldn't leave her alone. He strained against the beam, gritting his teeth against the pain. Suddenly, he felt a shift in the weight. He opened his eyes and saw Mary, her small frame braced against the beam, her face contorted with effort. She was pushing, her muscles straining, her eyes fixed on him, with fierce determination. Mary, no, get back, he shouted. But she ignored him. She continued to push, her breath coming in ragged gasps. He saw the fear in her eyes, but he also saw something else, a raw, unwavering protectiveness. She wasn't just trying to save him. She was fighting for him. With a final surge of strength, she managed to shift the beam just enough for him to wriggle free. He stumbled out of the stall, his shoulders screaming in protest. He grabbed Mary, pulling her away from the burning barn. Are you all right? He asked, his voice hoarse with concern. She nodded, her chest heaving. She had a long burn across her left forearm. We need to get out of here, she said, her voice trembling. They retreated to a safe distance, watching as the barn collapsed in a heap of burning embers. The heat was intense, the smoke acrid. But they were alive. They were together. As the dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of gray and orange, they stood in silence, surveying the devastation. The barn was gone, their livelihood threatened, but something had shifted between them. The flames had forged a bond, a shared experience that transcended words. Caleb looked at Mary, her face smudged with soot, her eyes red-rimmed but resolute. He saw a strength in her that he hadn't seen before, a fierce protectiveness that mirrored his own. She was no longer just a woman he was protecting. She was his partner, his equal. He reached out and took her hand, his grip firm. We'll rebuild, he said, his voice filled with conviction. Together. She squeezed his hand, her eyes meeting his. A faint smile touched her lips. Together. she echoed. The burning barn had been a moment of truth, a crucible that had tested their resolve and revealed the depth of their connection. It had been a tragedy, but it had also been a catalyst. It had transformed their initial coexistence into a genuine partnership, a bond forged in fire and strengthened by mutual respect and affection. The flames had etched their devotion against the night, a promise whispered in the smoke and ash. They would face whatever came together. Days bled into weeks, each sunrise a reminder of the charred remains of their barn. They lived frugally, salvaging what they could from the wreckage, patching up the house, sleeping in the hayloft. Caleb's shoulder throbbed, a constant ache that served as a reminder of their vulnerability. But he refused to let it slow him down. He had a debt to settle. He spent his days tracking Jedediah Thorne, learning his routines, his weaknesses. He discovered Thorne's dealings weren't limited to Mary's land. He was a parasite, feeding off the desperation of homesteaders, preying on their vulnerabilities, twisting the law to his advantage. Caleb found the proof he needed in the dusty records of the county courthouse. Forged deeds, inflated debts, and testimonies conveniently disappearing. Thorne had built his empire on lies and deceit. He found Thorne at the saloon in the nearest town, a den of iniquity filled with the smell of cheap whiskey and desperation. Thorne sat at a corner table, surrounded by his cronies, his face flushed with drink and self-importance. Caleb walked in, his presence silencing the room. He moved with a quiet purpose, his gaze fixed on Thorne. He didn't draw his gun. He didn't raise his voice. He simply walked to Thorne's table and placed the stack of documents in front of him. Thorne looked up, his eyes narrowing. "What's this, Reese?" he sneered, using Caleb's last name with a hint of mockery. "Evidence," Caleb said, his voice low but firm. "Evidence of your crimes. Forged deeds, inflated debts, missing testimonies. It's all here, Thorne." Thorne laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You think this scares me, Reese? You think you can come in here and threaten me?" "I'm not threatening you, Thorne," Caleb said calmly. "I'm offering you a choice. You can run, disappear, leave this land and never come back. Or you can face the consequences." Thorne's face flushed crimson. "You think you can dictate terms to me? I own this town, Reese. I own this county." "You own nothing, Thorne," Caleb said, his eyes unwavering. "You're a fraud, a cheat, a liar, and everyone knows it. They are just too afraid to speak up." He looked around the room, his gaze meeting the eyes of the other patrons. He saw fear, but he also saw a flicker of hope. Thorne's hand tightened around his glass. He was losing control. He signaled to his cronies, but they hesitated. They saw something in Caleb's eyes that made them wary. "Get him!" Thorne roared, his voice cracking. But no one moved. The silence in the room was deafening. Caleb reached into his pocket and pulled out a single document. He unfolded it and placed it on the table. It was a copy of Mary's original deed. The one Thorne had realized was invalid. But this one was different. This one was signed by Thorne himself, acknowledging its validity. "I found this hidden in your safe," Caleb said, his voice barely a whisper. "Looks like you forgot to destroy all the evidence." Thorne stared at the document, his face ashen. He knew he was finished. He had been outmaneuvered. He rose from his chair, his eyes filled with hatred. "You haven't won, Reese," he hissed. "This isn't over." Caleb remained silent, his gaze unwavering. He knew that Thorne was a broken man. He had lost everything. Thorne turned and stumbled out of the saloon, his cronies scattering like rats. The room remained silent for a moment. Then a murmur began to ripple through the crowd. They had witnessed a quiet reckoning, a triumph of justice over greed. Caleb picked up the documents and turned to leave. As he reached the door, a voice called out. "Thank you, Reese," a man said, his voice filled with gratitude. Caleb nodded, his eyes meeting the man's. He knew that he had done the right thing. He had protected Mary. He had restored justice. He walked out into the setting sun, leaving behind the saloon and the town, his heart lighter than it had been in years. The West was still wild, but it was a little less cruel. And that was enough. The ride back to the homestead was silent, the setting sun casting long shadows across the ravaged land. Caleb kept glancing at Mary, her face etched with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. He knew she was processing everything that had happened, the fire, the threat, and now Thorne's downfall. He wondered if she felt the same sense of closure he did. Back at the homestead, they settled in for the night, the silence broken only by the crackling fire. Mary stared into the flames, her thoughts a world away. Caleb knew he couldn't leave her like this. "He's gone, Mary," Caleb said softly, breaking the silence. "He won't bother you again." Mary didn't respond, her eyes fixed on the dancing flames. "Mary?" Caleb reached out and gently touched her hand. She flinched, as if startled. She finally looked up at him, her eyes filled with a pain he couldn't comprehend. "He said something," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Before he left. He said he was my father." Caleb felt a chill run down his spine. He hadn't heard Thorne say anything of the sort. He'd been too focused on Mary's safety, on ensuring Thorne left without causing further harm. "What?" Caleb asked, his voice laced with disbelief. "What did you say?" Mary's eyes filled with tears. "He said he was my father, that he left my mother years ago when I was just a baby, that he regretted it, but he was too ashamed to come back." The revelation hit Caleb like a physical blow. He couldn't imagine the pain Mary must be feeling, the confusion, the betrayal. To discover that the man who had tried to destroy her was actually her father, it was a cruel twist of fate. He pulled Mary close, wrapping his arms around her. He didn't know what to say. Words seemed inadequate in the face of such profound pain. "Is it true?" Mary asked, her voice trembling. Could it be true? Caleb didn't know. He had no way of knowing. But he knew that Mary needed answers. "We'll find out," he said, his voice resolute. "We'll find someone who knows, someone who can tell us the truth." The night passed in a haze of uncertainty and grief. Mary barely slept, tossing and turning, haunted by the ghost of her pest. Caleb stayed by her side, offering what comfort he could. As dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, Mary looked at Caleb, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and despair. "What do I do?" she asked, her voice pleading. How can I even think about rebuilding after this?" Caleb took her hand, his grip firm. "You don't have to do anything right now," he said. "You just need to focus on healing. We'll figure out the rest together." He knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult. The revelation about Thorne had shattered Mary's world, leaving her adrift in a sea of uncertainty. But he also knew that she was strong, resilient, and he would be there for her, every step of the way. He looked at her, his eyes filled with love and compassion. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew that he would face it with her. Together, he would help her rebuild her life, her spirit. And maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to make peace with the past. The land stretched before them, a vast and unforgiving expanse. But within that harsh landscape, a fragile seed of hope remained. He would nurture it, protect it, and help it grow. For Mary and for himself. The quiet cowboy knew what he had to do now, and it involved protecting Mary from something far more insidious than a burning barn. He had to protect her from the truth, or help her find a way to live with it. The days that followed were a blur of quiet grief and tentative steps towards healing. Mary moved through the routines of the farm like a ghost, her hands mechanically tending to the chickens, weeding the garden, but her eyes held a faraway look, a reflection of the turmoil within. The truth Thorne had revealed hung heavy in the air, a poison slowly seeping into her soul. Caleb watched her, his heart aching. He knew he couldn't force her to confront her pain, but he could offer her a safe space, a constant presence in the storm. He worked tirelessly, rebuilding the barn, mending fence, ensuring that the physical labor didn't overwhelm her, silently absorbing some of her burden. He spoke little, knowing that words were often inadequate, but his actions spoke volumes. Each repaired fence post, each newly planted seed, was a testament to his unwavering commitment. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in furry hues, Mary sat on the porch, staring out at the fields. Caleb joined her, settling beside her in comfortable silence. "He was a coward," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "To wait until the end to tell me. To use it as another weapon." Caleb nodded, understanding her anger. Thorne's revelation wasn't an act of contrition, but a final act of cruelty, designed to inflict maximum pain. "It doesn't change who you are, Mary," Caleb said, his voice gentle. "It doesn't diminish your strength, your kindness. It explains some things, maybe." Mary sighed, her gaze still fixed on the horizon. "What things?" "The way he looked at you," Caleb said. "Sometimes, when he thought no one was watching, there was a flicker of something there. Not kindness exactly, but recognition. Regret, maybe." Mary shivered, as if a cold wind had swept through her. "I don't want his regret," she said fiercely. "I don't want anything from him." "You don't have to," Caleb said, taking her hand. "You don't have to forgive him. You don't have to understand him. You just have to let it go. Let it stop poisoning you." He felt her hand tremble in his. He knew she was fighting a battle within herself, a struggle between anger and acceptance, between resentment and the faint, flickering hope for understanding. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, gradually, Mary began to heal. She started spending more time in the garden, tending to the flowers with a renewed sense of purpose. She started laughing again, a genuine, heartfelt sound that warmed Caleb's soul. She started to look forward, instead of backward. One afternoon, Caleb found her sitting by the creek, sketching in a worn leather-bound book. He approached her cautiously, not wanting to disturb her. "What are you drawing?" he asked softly. Mary looked up, a smile gracing her lips. She held up the book, revealing a detailed sketch of the new barn, the one Caleb had rebuilt with his own hands. "It's beautiful," Caleb said, his voice filled with admiration. "It's a new beginning," Mary said, her eyes meeting his. "For both of us." She closed the book and stood up, taking his hand. "Thank you, Caleb," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "For everything." He squeezed her hand, his heart swelling with emotion. He didn't need her thanks. He only needed her happiness. As they walked back to the homestead, hand in hand, the setting sun casting long shadows behind them, Caleb knew that they had both come a long way. The scars of the past would always be there, a reminder of the pain they had endured. But they were also a testament to their resilience, their strength, and their unwavering love for each other. They had faced the darkness together, and they had emerged stronger, more resilient, and more deeply connected than ever before. The land, once ravaged, now bloomed with renewed life, mirroring the transformation within their own hearts. The West remained wild, but it was also a place of healing, a place where even the deepest wounds could be mended, and where new beginnings were always possible. They stood together as the sun bled crimson onto the horizon, the vastness of the plains swallowing the day. The air, crisp and cool, carried the scent of summiage and the distant lowing of cattle. It was a tableau, etched in the heart of the West. Two figures silhouetted against a fiery sky, a sealant promise hanging between them. The farm, a testament to their shared labor, hummed with a quiet prosperity. The new barn, its timbers still bearing the scent of fresh-cut wood, stood proud against the skyline. The fields, once choked with weeds, now rippled with rows of corn, their tassels swaying gently in the breeze. Chickens scratched in the yard, there clucking a comforting counterpoint to the vast silence of the plains. Mary's garden, a riot of color and fragrance, was her sanctuary. Lavender and rosemary thrived alongside sunflowers, their voices turned toward the setting sun. It was a small oasis of beauty in a harsh land, a reflection of the blossoming within her own soul. Caleb watched her, his gaze filled with quiet admiration. He saw the strength that had bloomed in her eyes, the resilience that had taken root in her spirit. The shadows of the past still lingered, but they no longer held her captive. She had faced her demons, wrestled with her grief, and emerged victorious. He knew the revelation about Thorne would forever be a part of her story, a scar etched on her heart. But it would not define her. She would choose her own path, forge her own destiny, and he would be there, by her side, every step of the way. Mary turned to him, her eyes reflecting the golden light. She reached out and took his hand, her grip firm and reassuring. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" she said softly, her voice filled with a quiet contentment. Caleb nodded, his throat tight with emotion. He wasn't just seeing the sunset, the farm, the fields. He was seeing the beauty within her, the strength that had blossomed in the face of adversity. "We did good, Mary," he said, his voice low and gravelly. She smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "We did," she agreed. They stood in silence for a long moment, their hands clasped tightly together, watching as the last sliver of sun disappeared below the horizon. The sky deepened into shades of indigo and violet, and the first stars began to emerge, twinkling like diamonds scattered across a velvet cloth. The West remained wild, unforgiving, a land of harsh realities and unpredictable fortunes. But it was also a land of opportunity, a place where dreams could take root and flourish, where kindness could bloom in the most unexpected places. Caleb knew that the road ahead would not be easy. There would be challenges, hardships, moments of doubt. But he also knew that they would face them together, with courage, resilience, and unfearing love. He looked at Mary, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the stars. He saw a woman who had been broken, but not defeated, a woman who had found the strength to heal, to forgive, and to embrace a new beginning. He knew that he had found something special in this harsh and unforgiving land, a love that was as strong and enduring as the mountains themselves. And he would spend the rest of his days protecting it, cherishing it, and nurturing it, just as he had nurtured the land. As the night deepened, they turned and walked back towards the homestead, their silhouettes disappearing into the darkness. The farm, bathed in the soft light of the moon, stood as a beacon of hope, a testament to the transformative power of compassion, and a promise of a brighter future, forged in the heart of the Wild West. Kindness had taken root, a gentle